a musician,
long-distance kayaker,
a businessman,
she looks after animals,
artist,
author.
We interview remarkable people.
They're talented in so many different areas.
You're listening to The Dialogue.
89.7 FM Eastside Radio.
You're listening to 89.7 FM Eastside Radio. This is Natasha and The Dialogue Show, where I interview remarkable people. On the show today, I have Tanya Jackson-Vaughan, who is the Executive Director of the Refugee Advice and Casework Service. I'm really excited to have you on my show.
Thank you, Natasha.
Because the refugee crisis is something I feel quite strongly about, and I've always been really vocal about it, especially, on the only platform I have, which is Facebook. I wish I had a better platform, and now I do. Now I actually have the show, so I'm kind of excited about having you in here. And also because it's nice to meet somebody that you know is really making a difference and changing the way things work for some people. So you told me earlier that helping people is really important for you. Why? Why do you think that helping people? I mean, not everybody grows up to want to help somebody else.
Look, I think, we're on the planet once. And if we don't do the best we can with that one chance, you're going to have a life of regrets. And I think, I have, I've had a life of privilege. I'm white. I've had a middle class upbringing. I've got parents that love me. And I just think that you need to go to work and you need to have purpose. You need to think, today my life has meaning. And as much as one needs money, I'm not driven by it.
You said that you grew up in a middle-class family. You were born in Wimbledon. That is definitely very middle-class. And you said that, a fairly charmed middle-class upbringing. Parents that were lovely and warm and fabulous and some siblings. But you did mention that having returned there, you were quite shocked by some of your classmates and that sort of entrenched classism that they kind of have in the UK. Why do you think that kind of exists? Because, I mean, obviously you really sort of were repelled by that.
Look, I think there really is a strong polarisation in England. I've got friends who went to university and they sort of have a life like me where, they're aware of the people other than them who are struggling, whereas it seems the people I went to school with, it's like, well, where'd you go for lunch and what do you do today? And much more concerned with material things. I think, I don't know, look, maybe since the dawn of Thatcher, things have become much more about you as an individual and people looking inwards and looking at how they can achieve rather than, how we can live in a better society.
I've interviewed quite a lot of people on the show who are obviously very active in the space that you're in, and not necessarily refugees, but in helping people or doing something. And their belief, and often comes through, is that you need to do the work, that in life, this one journey that you're kind of having through life is about the work. Do you kind of buy into that?
What do you mean exactly?
When, it's about being active and working every day and not looking inwards, actually looking externally to create happiness for yourself rather than looking inwards to find that happiness.
Yeah, certainly. I think, look, you have to be happy with who you are so that you can perform your best. And if you are happy with yourself, you then can be in a position where you're happy taking risks. And in order to make a difference, you need to take risks. You need to, in order to, if you don't dream, you won't achieve, a better place, a better world, really, I think.
You started, it's quite interesting because we're talking about, being frivolous and sort of talking about what you ate that day. And yet your first job that you went into, even though you wanted to go to law, you wanted to do law, you did a university degree, and then sort of wanted to go to law, but landed up flipping and going into film and TV, which is, let's be honest, I mean, there's nothing more plastic and nothing, more sort of fake than that kind of environment. And yet you loved it.
Yeah, I loved it. It was fun. I was in my 20s and you'd end up in strange locations with, fun people. And there was just something I don't know, exciting about it, actually. I was busy. I think I'm a hard worker, and you had to work very hard, and I enjoy working hard. But the people were good. You know, I think it was a great thing to do in your early 20s.
How long did you work in film and TV for? I mean, between UK and Australia?
10 years.
So it was quite a while.
Yeah, I know.
You left the UK at 26. What did you actually work on while you were there? Was it TV? Was it film?
I worked in Jim Henson's Creature Shop, where they made Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles and things like that. And I was a runner, so it was the lowest of the low. But it was fun. You know, I was working with artists, and it was enlightening for me because I'd enjoyed art at school, and I never thought you could have a career in it. And I saw that you could.
You're listening to 89.7 FM Eastside Radio. This is Natasha and The Dialogue Show, where I interview remarkable people. On the show today, I have Tanya Jackson-Vaughan, Executive Director of the Refugee Advice and Casework Service. You came to Australia when you were 26. Your parents were actually Australian. Even though you were born in the UK, they were Australian. They were back here, and you decided when you were lonely, as you know, and you wanted to come sort of some connection, and came over to Australia, and then landed up working here in the same industry, in that film and TV industry, and worked on some pretty impressive projects. Can you tell me a little bit about the ones that you found really exciting?
I think doing Time for Patsy Cline was interesting. That was, we went to Griffith, and I had to sort of, you know, try and wrangle 1,000 line dancers. I worked on Babe only for a short period when I was actually pregnant with one of my children, but that was Babe 2 was a 2-year project. But it was fascinating to see how they use special effects to get animals to do strange things. And my first film was working on Yahoo Serious' Reckless Kelly, which involved working with quite a few quite famous actors, and was in a beautiful location. Even though it wasn't the roaring success that possibly the director would have liked, it was a great film to work on.
You met your husband while you were working in film, and you said that the two of you working 16-hour days and literally ships in the night and having children was just way too much, way too hard. So you kind of left that and then went to work in teaching at UNSW. But you said that there was like a real emotional shift for you during that time, and that was when this whole refugee crisis started to really become something you kind of owned, really, in a lot of ways. Tell me a little bit about that shift.
So I just had my second child in 2001, and around that time we had the Tampa, which, as I was explaining to you, was when a freight ship found and rescued this very rickety boat full of people seeking asylum, and took them on board, and then asked the Australian government to help. And when they refused, it became almost a massive election issue in the end, and there was a bipartisan approach. And that, for me, I just was so shocked by this reckless attitude towards people's lives, that I thought I have to do something. And because I'd done a history and French degree, I was able to do a teaching English as a second language course. And that led me down a path that I'd never thought I'd be, but I really enjoyed it. It was really giving people the gift of English. It makes such a significant difference to people's lives when they're here, trying to start a new safe life. You
talk about safety quite a bit. So safety tends to kind of come up for you when we were chatting earlier. You talk about sort of safety, and then you use the word thriving as well. Now, there are a lot of people out there who, are frightened of change, frightened of new people coming along and thriving, because they're scared that that's going to kind of somehow diminish their lives. What do you think, when you talk about safety and thriving, how do you see us including refugees and people who weren't born here into our lives and into the lives of Australia?
I think ideally, currently we're facing a regime where people can only apply for temporary protection. And that's a really impossible way for people to live. The temporary protection gives them 3 or 5 years worth of safety, and they can't bring their family here. So ultimately, to allow people to have a safer life, a fuller life, they need to be able to settle permanently. They need to be able to reunite with their families. We need to give people opportunities to have the time and space to learn English so that they're able to then go on to get jobs similar to the ones they had when they were back home. We need to, currently we're not allowing people seeking asylum or refugees who've got scholarships presented to them by universities. We're not allowing them to take them up. We're saying that you can't receive financial support for more than 12-month course. It's becoming really impossible for young people to have the hope of a better life through education if they're classed as refugees who came by boat. So there's so many things that we could change to make people's lives a lot easier.
I used the word earlier, assimilation, and you didn't like that word. In my understanding of that terminology is that people become comfortable, in the space that they're in. But you saw that as a word that had more of a negative connotation to it. And I'm interested in why, because that would be something that a lot of people would think, we want everyone to assimilate. We'd like to all be grey. Wouldn't it be great if we were all grey and we were all the same, and then, we could all eat the same food? And I don't necessarily think that at all, but that was a word that I'm familiar with. So tell me a little bit about this word assimilation and what it connotates for you.
Well, I think exactly that. Assimilation is almost the opposite of diversity. And for me, the richness of Australia as it currently is now is because of its diversity. It's a country of migrants. People, the first peoples are here. They're indigenous. And, they had people forced upon them. But I think, we haven't assimilated to the indigenous way of life.
No, and I'm never going into the desert ever to go and look for my goanna.
So why should we expect other people to come and assimilate? I think the richness of Australia, it really is a very rich multicultural country, is the fact that generally people from different cultures are accepted and welcomed. And assimilation to me, it seems to be that sort of colonial expectation of everybody is going to abide by the same dress code, the same, as you said, we don't want to live in a grey world, do we?
No. It's quite interesting because you have an English accent. Yeah. Your parents are Australian. I have a South African accent. My father is Australian. And yet I pretty much am sure that for both of us, even though English is our first language and probably well educated into that English language, and yet I struggle to assimilate or to fit in at times culturally. So, and I've been here for 20 years. So it's an interesting thing to assume that people who don't speak English as a first language, who culturally are so completely different, would just be able to do it really easily because they go and sit an English exam or because they get a piece of paper that tells them, how Australian culture is supposed to work. Tell me a little bit about what refugees and people who come to this country face on a day-to-day basis that challenges them.
In Australia?
Yes.
So people who came here seeking asylum, they came here because they wanted to apply for protection. They want a protection visa. We've had various policies that have stopped them doing that. For the first 3 years when they came here, they weren't allowed to work. So they just were in this limbo, and it was just awful for people who are really entrepreneurial. They got up and came. They took agency. We sort of forced stagnation on them. I think the people here, they want, they want to be able to have status that allows them to remain in Australia, to be productive, to earn a living, to support their families, to give their children the opportunity of a safe life, a life where they're not persecuted because they're a particular religion or a particular colour or a particular, gender or sexuality. And they want to be with their families. That's really what they want.
Judging people is a very natural human reaction. It's bred into us from a young age, and I think it's to some degree part of our natural reaction. Do you ever find that you sit there and judge people as well? I mean, it must be hard. It must be really hard because you're in this job where you're supposed to, I want to say love everyone, but you're not a nun. But you're supposed to be helping everyone, and yet you must find that you are really conflicted at times.
Look, I think there are times when, and that's part of the job of the lawyers at RACS, people come to us seeking assistance to apply for protection. Some of them won't be found to be refugees. And the job of the lawyer, and this is why legal assistance is really important, is to actually, on legal advice, is to say, look, sometimes you listen to somebody's reasons why they want to seek protection. You say, actually, that doesn't fit with the definition. I understand that, you're this, and this has happened to you, but this isn't actually the definition of refugee. And unfortunately, you most probably you won't be successful. So that is part of the job of the lawyers. Generally speaking, I mean, I think in life, you always come across people that, are challenging one way or another. I mean, for me, I think it's more challenging dealing with the bigoted attitudes towards people seeking asylum and not being angry about it and trying to understand that attitude normally comes from a place of fear. But that's really hard. I mean, I don't listen to Q&A. I try to really cocoon myself from things that will make me angry or upset, because
what happens when you get angry? When you get angry, what do you do?
When I used to watch Q&A, I used to shout at the television. But I try not to do that anymore because I can't sleep on Monday nights. I don't know. It's hard. Look, I think what is good, and that's the good thing about where we work, is there's some really very kind and compassionate people who you can share your frustrations with, and that helps. We offload, and we do provide sort of a lot of support and vicarious trauma sort of stuff for people, so that they are able to articulate frustrations.
Did you join as the executive director of the Refugee Advice and Casework service? So you actually came on in that role, and you've been there for 7 years, which is quite a while. Before that, though, you had a job for a couple of years that kind of led into that really helped you sort of get to the nuts and bolts of what these people are going through. Tell me a little bit about how you went from teaching English to people for the second language. So
with teaching, I was teaching some old ladies who lived in the Waterloo Tower blocks, who were from former Soviet Union. And I ended up, through that work, helping them with other bits of their life that they needed help with. There was redevelopment of the area being threatened, and I kind of suggested, they could write letters, and I'd help them with that, or I'd write forms. So it was kind of like that understanding that, it's not just a human being isn't just an English language problem or a legal problem. They're a whole person. And then I had the opportunity to start working as the office manager and helping people in the electorate of Anthony Albanese, working for him. And that's really where I became very informed about immigration problems, going from people seeking protection to people who are on 457 visas, whose employer shut down the business and they needed to find another sponsor, and the challenges of training for a particular skill because it's on a skilled migration list, and then the skills that were needed that particular year changing. So I became really interested in the multifarious issues that came up for people, and we had people walking through the door and you never knew what problem they were going to present you with. And then because we worked for Shadow and then a minister, we were able to access people within the immigration department who could give you advice on what might be best for those people.
The people that come to you are often very stressed. they're under a certain amount of emotional strain, and there's a lot of fear around, because you said it's the last place they come to usually. You're the last stop. They try to work it out for themselves and ask people around them for help, and then you're the next place to go. So dealing with that, do you have special training as a group? I mean, you've now got 35 staff, which is quite a significant number. You said you started with 9. You now have 35. Do they need to go through a training process to deal with it?
So, we're kind of often the first port of call at RACS. Anthony's people as a politician, the electorate office, and it was often the last port of call because they'd tried everything else. But at RACS, we do a number of things. One, you have lawyers, and they've got the legal training, which kind of gives them that a level of objectivity. We have the torture and trauma counselling services do some vicarious trauma training for our staff. And we have weekly staff meetings where people will debrief around, certain issues. And I think because we've tried to create an environment in the office which is very people focused, it's there's an environment where people can share how they're feeling, debrief about a particularly hard moment with a client, and there's always people there ready to listen. I certainly always have my door open. People can walk through the door and talk to me at any point if they have a problem, or if you hear somebody having a difficult conversation. People are threatening suicide a lot at the moment because of the levels of strain that they're under. You go in and you have a chat to them and say, are you okay? Do you need to speak to somebody? And we do suicide prevention training as well for everybody, the volunteers and the lawyers, so that they know how to sort of de-escalate issues.
You're listening to 89.7 FM Eastside Radio. This is Natasha and The Dialogue Show, where I interview remarkable people. On the show today, I have Tanya Jackson-Vaughan, Executive Director of the Refugee Advice and Casework Service. You yourself have obviously thrown yourself into an area that is very challenging and very emotionally challenging. How do you work? I mean, do you get to the point where do you cry? Have you had moments where you just feel like you just can't wait, you just don't want to go on anymore?
When we lost funding in 2014, I was having to spend my days going, yes, we'll be fine, everybody, don't worry, those organisations there and there, they've fundraised, we can do it. And because I had everybody going, we're doomed, and then I go home and cry.
Right.
And then I also have spent a lot of time working with people who do sort of coaching and leadership training to try and get me through those difficult moments, because it has been very challenging dealing with staffing changes, funding changes, all of those things, whilst at the same time having to perform, because when you want to go out and fundraise, you need to, be very upbeat, and
which is how you've presented yourself today, which is why I find it really interesting. I mean, so you've actually honed that skill of kind of presenting yourself in a very positive light, because your funding is quite low. The government has really stripped more than 50% away from that, which I find really tragic. And you're now actually in a role where you need to go and ask for money, which is not easy.
No, it's not. But I'd never done it before. Now I've been doing it for 4 years. And I think the thing is that I totally believe in the work we do. I am in such admiration of the lawyers and the work they do, and the difference having a lawyer makes to a person's life as they go through a really, really rigorous process. So it's easy to talk about it, and how the impact is significant on human beings. And look, I think over the past few years, because they have been difficult, I've recognised that as a leader, one has to work on oneself and be really kind to yourself, and make sure that you recognise the strengths you have and not focus on the weaknesses. And that's really kind of the approach we've used at a leadership level at RACS, where we have a leadership team, and everybody has different strengths, and we support each other.
You yourself have been quite well recognised for the work that you've done. I know you're quite humble and you weren't going to say anything, but I did read that about you. Do you want to take us through a little bit of that?
Do you mean the Impact 25 thing?
But you have. So you've stepped up and you've stepped out. So it's interesting. How do you feel about putting yourself into that light? Because I mean, working with people to help them is often not about necessarily promoting yourself, but you have to do that in the same way and be recognized for it.
So when I first started at RACS, when I had to give to speak publicly, I'd almost glaze over and I'd get hot sweats. Now I can do it quite easily. I mean, I still get a bit stressed beforehand, but I just go out there and do it now, and I see it as it's almost like you're performing. I'm not really, and I recognise now too, as a executive director, that is my role. It's sort of to go out there, and I'm promoting the organisation, but have to be out there to do it. But it's something that I'm really happy to talk up everybody else, but I do find talking myself up a bit, it's not exactly what natural to me, I suppose.
That's my job, really, to get you to talk about yourself. It's such a hard job that you do. And actually, it's really interesting because I find that the women who I often interview who are exceptional and remarkable as you are often deal with life in a far more practical way. They're less emotional, and then so their emotions don't rule. They're a little bit more practical, and so that practicality comes in, and the work becomes really, really important. But for all of you who do the work, and particularly for you, Tanya, there must be a moment that you like where you just stop. What do you do when you just stop? I mean, what is your thing? What is your go-to thing?
Well, look, I've got a lovely husband and 2 daughters, and I've got a beautiful Labrador. So when I come home, he needs a lot of attention because he's a 3-year-old puppy that bounces, and I have to say that's been extraordinary, having that sort of immediate de-stress. We had a beautiful 7-week holiday last year where we sort of took off, and that was extraordinarily healing, I think, really, and gave us all a lot of strength. And look, I'm about to, the Sydney Film Festival's happening. I'm going to take a day off and go with friends to that. I'm not great at switching off, I must say, but I need to sort of focus on that a bit more.
Well, no, it probably would be quite good given that the job that you do is fairly stressful, and also, not necessarily ever going to end. I imagine that the more strife the world remains in, the more likely Australia will be to be dealing with a refugee situation, and so I imagine that's kind of ongoing. And if I were to ask you, because we've actually come to the end of the interview and it always goes so quickly, if I were to ask you what your X factor is, I mean, the one thing that makes you wake up every morning and keep going, what is your X factor?
I think the hope that at some point there might be a change in the way people treat people seeking protection, and also the attitudes that we're going to live in a kind of nicer world at some point. I'm just really scared by the racism, the targeting of people, the othering of people now. It just makes me sad. It makes me really frightened. But, that's what I hope for. I hope for, somewhere where we actually, compassion is kind of the driver rather than focusing on hate.
Thank you so much.
Pleasure.
You've been listening to The Dialogue with Natasha Moy, and I have been talking to Tanya Jackson-Vaughan, Executive Director of the Refugee Advice and Casework Service. I will be back next week with another fantastic interview.